everyone, welcome back to another week on the Brush by Brandy YouTube channel. This week we are working on this project behind me, and this is actually, it would be like a cedar chest, but we're going to make it into a toy chest. And this was brought to me by actually my sister, who's got young girls and her house is filled with toys. We all remember that phase, right? So she wants some toy storage that looks a little classier, that can go in a living space and maybe be disguised so that you don't know that half of your living space has really been overtaken by children. So we're going to take this pretty plain chest here that just has a coat of primer on it, and we're going to add some more sophisticated finishes so that what's inside does not match the outside. And this is some sophisticated toy storage. I think it's going to be a cool project. I pick up these chests anytime I can. They're super popular and you can disguise them in a million different ways. So you guys, if you're looking for some different types of storage in your home, don't pass these guys by. Stick around. Let's do some fun things to this one and spice it up a bit. Let's get started. Here's where I started on this piece. It came to me with a coat of purple paint on it. It wasn't poorly done at all. This piece is actually made of laminate, but it's got really pretty lines on it. I decided to remove the medallion from the front. I didn't really care for that, and I didn't think it fit with my final look. I gave this an overall scuff sanding. It was a chalky style paint that was on it, so it should grip pretty well, but I'm going to go ahead and give this a coat of gray primer from Wise Owl. I chose to go ahead and prime this one because I know I want to take it from the dark color to an overall lighter color scheme, and this is going to help me. With my primer nice and dry, I decided that I wanted to add some sophistication with a raised stencil look on this. I'm going to use this stencil from Royal Design Stencils called Damascus Damask, and I'm just going to apply some joint compound to give it a raised texture. I'm just scraping it over the surface of my stencil using a bowl scraper, which is actually a kitchen tool. I do keep my joint compound in the refrigerator before using it, and that just helps it set up so it's a little bit firmer when I scrape it over the surface of my stencil. The container that you saw that in, this is actually not the right container. I scoop it into a smaller container for storage, but I actually buy this in a larger quantity. It's fairly cheap from the hardware store. When I remove this stencil, you can see the beautiful pattern that it leaves behind on the cedar chest. I already love it. So initially I decided to give this a blended finish, and I started blending over my stencil, but I felt like my stencil got lost. So I kept this in my video just so you could see that it was a step in my process, but ultimately I decided not to use the blended finish on this. This is a blend of Wise Owl grays, and I really like this color combination, so I think I'm going to save it for another piece. Seeing the blended finish on this raised stencil actually really helped me kind of decide the direction that I want to go to. I want the raised stencil to be a feature of this piece. I really liked the contrast, how it looked with the white stencil against the gray body, so I'm going to kind of use that as my direction. I decided to go ahead, and once my blended look was dry, I gave this an overall coat of Wise Owl paint in weathervane, which is going to be the base, my dark gray paint that I'm going to do my decoration on. When I was planning for this finish, I was a little unsure which way I should go, whether I wanted my dark color on the bottom and then dry brushing with the lighter color, or a light color and dry brushing with the darker. So I tried it actually both ways on this side, and I ended up preferring much more the dark base and then dry brushing with my creamy whites over top. This I think is just going to end up getting too dark, and I actually want to keep it lighter. So that was a little bit of the process that I went through to try to determine whether I layered my darker color on the bottom or I started with a lighter color underneath. So these are both just variations of the same color scheme, but just in a different order. All right, so now that I've got my overall direction kind of decided, I'm going to go ahead and dry brush some creamy white colors over the top of my dark gray paint. So the colors that I'm using are Wise Owl paint in ivory, which is one of the new colors from their Desert Sunset collection, along with Snow Owl. I like the contrast of the pure white and the creamy white, and I'm just dry brushing them in kind of a random fashion. I'm using a flat synthetic bristle brush, but it's got a little more coarse bristle, so it's going to give me a little bit of texture to my dry brushing. Dry brushing is basically whisking a brush that's got barely any paint on it over the top of my raised stencil. So I load my brush, and then I'll either dab it off on my floor or a rag to lay some of the paint off, because I want barely any paint on the tips of my bristles. It's going to mean that I refill my brush frequently to get that little bit of paint on, and then I'm going to brush until basically it runs out. And I'm hitting the tops of the raised stencil, so it's going to kind of start bringing forward that design. I alternated the creamy white and the pure white, and that just gave a little bit of contrast. It starts looking like a worn tapestry, and I liked the way that that creamy white sort of looked like an aged white next to the pure white for contrast. Because I'm adding very little paint with this dry brushing at a time, it actually dries really quickly so I can continue to layer the paint on. So let's go ahead and layer up this dry brushing until we get to the final look, and we'll move on to our next step. With my dry brushing complete, let's go ahead and pay attention to the top of this piece. So I did go ahead and coat the top in just a plain coat of Weisel gray linen, and now I'm spraying it with a coat of shellac. The shellac is going to slick the top up a little bit because I plan on running a wood grain tool over the top of this. The wood graining tool is made of silicone, and I don't want the silicone to stick to my paint underneath, and so this coat of shellac just helps it glide a little bit smoother over the top. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to randomly brush on 3 different colors. The colors I'm using are Weisel paint in Thunderstruck, Earth, and Ivory, and these are all 3 colors from the new Desert Sunset collection as well. I'm just brushing these colors on in kind of a random order. I want to make sure I have some contrast in between the colors, so I try to not duplicate 2 next to each other. I let them overlap and kind of intermingle. It is very important during this step that you keep your paint wet, so I'm going to continuously mist it using my mister bottle to keep the paint from starting to set up. I want to make sure that it's wet because I do want to run that wood graining tool through it, and if my paint is already dry, it's not going to leave the wood grain pattern in it. With my paint still wet, I'm going to go ahead and take my wood graining tool. This was just purchased off Amazon, and I'm going to go ahead and run it through the wet paint. Now you'll notice that I alternate directions on each stroke. That's because I want this to look like a genuine wood plank, and usually the grain pattern doesn't run in the same direction. So this gives it a nice contrast to look like pieces of wood laid next to each other. When I'm running the wood graining tool over it, I give it some light pressure, and then I'm going to rock the tool as I'm pulling it. Once I went through my top one time, I decided that I didn't really care for the look. I felt like the colors were too defined, and then when I ran the wood graining tool through them, it made them even more defined. So I want to mix my colors up a little bit more. I'm just going to brush them together. So I'm going to rebrush the same colors. I'm going to overbrush them a little more this time so there's less definition, and then I'm going to run my graining tool through it again. And I was able to do this with no problem because I kept that paint nice and wet, so I just add a little bit of water and I can continue to brush through it as many times as I want. So this is just a repeat of the same process we did the first time. I'm going to take my graining tool with light pressure on it and pull and rock at the same time. It can take a little bit of practice to get the motion of the tool right, but once you do, it's really, really simple to use. I chose the colors that I'm using on the piece because they match the decor in my sister's house. She's got a lot of grays and creams and beiges, very light neutral decor. She's not a really big color person in her main living areas, and so I want to make sure that I can tie this in with her decor. The room that this is going in has a purpley gray tone on the wall. It's a gray with undertones of purple in it, much like the Thunderstruck color that I'm using on the body of this piece. And then it's got a light linen colored couch. And so I think these colors in this are going to match perfectly. I ended up liking the top much better after the second time. So now I've got the top done. My body paint is looking good. Let's add some wax details. All right, we are going to take this side of my piece and we're going to duplicate it over to this side. So the difference I have here is I've added some black wax shading around the edges. And now I'm going to go ahead and do that over here. And you can see already right at the bottom how much that deepens the paint color. So I start off with a dark paint color down there, and then when I add that wax detailing, it just emphasizes those dark areas that are already darkened from the paint. So one of the wax brushes that I really am liking to use, I'll show you all of them that I'm going to use. I'm going to use this, which is just a chip brush that I've cut the tips off. I'm going to use this to get into crevices like this down here. I've got this guy here that I'll use to get into smaller crevices. For example, these fluting details here. I've got one of these that I'm going to use to kind of smudge it out. And then I actually really like this brush. This is from Daydream Apothecary. And I've dedicated this one to wax, but it's a really nice soft synthetic bristle brush. And I'm going to use this to kind of smudge out and soften some of the areas so I get this kind of soft halo effect. So with these 4 brushes, I'm going to create some wax detailing. Let's get started on that. That wax shadowing just sort of emphasized the look that I already had going with the paint. It just magnifies the dark areas a little bit more. Now I'm going to add a little bit of dry brushing to the edge of this top. It just had the plain gray linen color on it, and I want it to kind of tie in with the patterns that I've got going on the piece. So I just used my same dry brushing technique that I used on the front, and I just hit the edges of this top a little bit. To also tie in with the body, I want to carry those dark wax details up to this top as well. So I just took my brushes and I gave the crevices a little bit of that black wax, and then I worked that in a little bit, and now it matches all the details on the front. I am just about done on this piece. It's time for some finishing touches. Of course, I gave it some satin varnish from Wiesel Paint. I'm just applying this using a sponge. I went ahead and gave it 3 coats to the top and 2 coats to the body. I added some handles to the side so it can be pulled around the room, and then also some wheels are going to go up underneath. So this piece is done. I love how it turned out, you guys. I think it's really neutral and sophisticated. I think it's going to go great in her room. That pattern is gorgeous. The stencil is fantastic. I absolutely love the pattern on it. As always, you can find links for everything I used in the description for this post. You can find more Brush by Brandy on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube, and on my website at brushbybrandy.com.